Sheikh Hassan Rashid made a video titled Response to Hassan Radwan, Atheists and Former Muslims, where he attempted to answer the question, why would God create people he knows will burn in hell forever? This question highlights arguably the greatest contradiction in the concept of God in Islam. On the one hand, God is the most merciful of the merciful, and his mercy encompasses all things. Yet at the same time, he needlessly creates beings knowing they will suffer eternal torment. It's difficult for our minds to understand the notion of eternity, and as a result, I don't think most people really stop to contemplate the full horror of what is being asserted. But here's an analogy that might help. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. This 13 billion years saw the expansion of time and space, the formation of galaxies, stars and planets. After billions of years, our planet formed and saw the gradual emergence of life from tiny bacteria to the first complex multicellular life forms, to the dinosaurs, and then eventually to man. Now imagine that during this 13 billion years, a person is being repeatedly burnt alive. Day after day, this horrific suffering has been going on for billions of years. Yet this man's suffering has barely begun. This 13 billion years does not even amount to the first second of the first day of eternity. But here's the kicker. God created these creatures when he didn't have to, while knowing they will suffer this unimaginable pain for all eternity. One cannot argue that God is forced to do this, as it would deny his omnipotence. Nor can one argue that God wants to do this, as it would mean God is malevolent. It is an irreconcilable contradiction. The knee-jerk response most Muslims give is that God granted humans the gift of free will, a gift he does not violate. So he allows them to make their own choices, even if it has terrible consequences. However, this is a false argument and completely misses the point. God would not be violating their free will if he didn't create them in the first place. You can't violate the free will of something that doesn't exist, just as God has not violated the free will of the infinite number of humans he didn't create. As for believers, they still have free will. The fact that God knows they will believe and submit does not deny them their free will, nor does it even mean they will not sin. Some believers will even enter hell for a temporary period. There is simply no need to create beings that will end up suffering an eternity of torture. And to claim a wise and merciful God would choose to do this is the contradiction of all contradictions. However, as I said, Sheikh Asrar addressed a video to me personally where he claims to have answered this question. So I thought I'd take a quick look at his arguments, as well as those by Sheikh Wissam Sharqawi, who also attempted to answer this same question. Sheikh Asrar's first response to this question is
firstly, Allah does what he wills. فَعَالٌ لِمَا يُرِيدُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give life to whom he wills and death to whom he wills. He can be merciful to whom he wills and punishes whom he wills.
This is an appeal to faith and doesn't answer the question. Obviously, if an omnipotent God exists, he can do whatever he wants. But who's to say it's the God of Islam? How do we know Islam's depiction of God is not simply a man-made fiction? One thing we do know for certain about humans throughout history is that they have a tendency to invent gods. Unless one already has faith in this particular God, then they have no choice but to use human reason to assess the actions of this character that they are being asked to believe in. They must assess whether creating beings only to later eternally torture them is compatible with the notion of a wise and merciful God. Of course, I realise that appeals to faith are an effective way believers deal with problematic issues. It was certainly how I dealt with this question when I was a Muslim. I trusted the Quran when it assured me that God is the most just and will never wrong a soul. I recalled the hadith that God is more merciful than a mother to her child, and a mother would never throw her child into the fire. However, although appeals to faith may silence questions for the faithful, at least for a while, they are meaningless to those seeking a rational answer. He then asserted that life, intellect and free will is a greater favour than non-existence.
The second and more detailed response, which is in the book, is that my argument is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving life, intellect and free will is better and as a favour than the person not existing.
This couldn't be more untrue. A life of 70-odd years, followed by a never-ending existence of being burnt alive, is without a shadow of a doubt worse than non-existence. Whatever brief joys one may experience in life, it can never outweigh an infinite existence of torture. Sheikh Rashid then presents a thought experiment, whether to kill baby Hitler.
I give a thought experiment. The thought experiment is you travel back in time, you reach a place where there is baby Hitler. You now have the option to kill baby Hitler. If you decide not to kill him, the question is, why do you decide not to kill him? The response is very simple, because baby Hitler has the right to life, intellect, and free will. If he chooses to kill baby Hitler, then he can never question God when God destroys and kills, and when God punishes, and when God carries out his divine actions, because the knowledge of God is eternal. So if with a man with his limited knowledge thinks he has the right to kill baby Hitler, then how can he object to the knowledge of God? If he allows baby Hitler to live, then he cannot object to God creating baby Hitler, because he allowed baby Hitler to live, because baby Hitler has the right to life, free will and intellect. So both ways the answer is given.
This is a false analogy. The dilemma of whether to deny the right to life, intellect and free will to a baby that will grow up to be evil is irrelevant. The question is, why create them in the first place? If God doesn't create them, he is not denying them the right to life, intellect and free will, because they don't exist. As I say, you can't deny anything to something that doesn't exist. If that were the case, then God has denied life, intellect and free will to the infinite number of beings he could have created. But as I say, this is false, because you cannot deny anything to something that doesn't exist. Plus, how a person might react to the moral dilemma of baby Hitler is open to debate, but whether the person chooses to kill him or not, he didn't create Hitler, and he is not torturing anyone for eternity. This is completely different to a God who creates humans knowing he will be torturing these creatures for eternity, and does this when he has no need to. There can be no circumstances that could force an omnipotent God to include eternal torture in his ultimate plans for creation. If it wasn't for the dictates of faith, no one would argue that creating such needless eternal suffering is compatible with the notion of a wise and merciful God. Sheikh Rashid then moves on to a different question, which I've addressed elsewhere in my article on the status principle. The next video is of Sheikh Wissam Sharqawi. He begins by asserting that foreknowledge doesn't transform a good act into an evil act.
A person may ask, and you mentioned this at the beginning, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything that has happened, will happen, and is happening. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that a person X, that he's going to go through life, or she's going to go through life, be a sinner, and then end up in the hellfire. A person could say, then why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow that to happen? What would the response be?
It's a very important question to address. And I want to start by saying that the question itself fails for many, many reasons. The first one is that knowledge in and of itself doesn't transform an act from being one that is good into one that is evil.
That entirely depends on the details of the case. In particular, whether the known benefit outweighs the known harm. In the case of God creating disbelievers knowing they will spend an eternity of torture, the known harm is quite literally infinitely greater than the known benefit. He then gives an example of a father buying a bicycle for his son, knowing he will fall off at some point.
Let me give you an example. If I venture into the marketplace and I go to purchase a bike for my child, I have absolute conviction and yaqeen that one day my child will fall off that bike. I know they're going to fall off that bike. So despite me having the knowledge that my child is going to fall off that bike, I purchased the bike anyway. That knowledge of me knowing that did not alter that good act that I did and change it into a bad one.
Comparing falling off a bike with eternal torture is again a false and shockingly bad analogy. Obviously, if the father knew his son would die, never mind be eternally tortured, he wouldn't buy the bicycle. The father may know his son is likely to receive cuts and bruises, but he also knows he will eventually learn to ride the bike. Buying a bicycle has a good purpose. This is totally different to a God who creates people knowing they will end up in eternal hell, a place that has no purpose for them other than endless torture. The irony is that the Sheikh's analogy demonstrates the exact opposite to that which he intended. The pain suffered when learning to ride a bike has a beneficial purpose. It is intended to lead to something good. Creating people in the knowledge they will suffer eternal hell does not lead to any benefit for them. It doesn't aim to teach them, improve them, or correct them. It's not remedial, instructive, or purifying. Its sole purpose is to inflict the most extreme and never-ending suffering as an end in itself for all eternity. Although Sheikh Wissam said the question fails for many, many reasons, these are actually the only arguments he provides. He spends the rest of the video dismissing the validity of the question and making several appeals to faith. Despite the dismissive stance of these and other Muslim apologists, this is a crucially fundamental question. It goes to the very heart of the nature of the God Islam presents us with, and which we are being asked to believe in. It's a question that has deeply troubled the minds of the greatest theologians and scholars throughout the centuries, including many Islamic scholars. One of these was Ibn Taymiyyah, who towards the end of his life was so profoundly concerned by this question that he felt compelled to challenge the orthodoxy of his day and write a treatise arguing that hell was finite. There are links below to Ibn Taymiyyah's treatise in its original Arabic, as well as my English translation, plus a lecture on the treatise by Yasir Qadi.
Let's begin by this book of Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, this is a book that is titled الرد على من قال بفناء الجنة والنار, the refutation of those who said that heaven and hell are both going to cease to exist. And this is one of his last booklets that he ever wrote. In fact, it might be the very last booklet that he ever wrote. I think it is fair to claim that Ibn Taymiyyah did hold the position that hell is not eternal.
Ibn Taymiyyah states at one point, "As for creating souls who commit evil in this world, while in the hereafter they will only exist in torment, this is a contradiction in which appears a contradiction of wisdom and mercy that does not appear in anything else." I'm certainly no fan of Ibn Taymiyyah, but I have to give him credit. He hit the nail on the head here. A God of infinite wisdom, and whose mercy embraces all things, creates man, not for his benefit, for God is self-sufficient and needs nothing, but for man's benefit, while knowing with infallible certainty that a huge portion of these wretched creatures will simply exist in a state of horrific eternal torture. People he had no need to create. It's not reason that leads people to affirm such a preposterous proposition. It's fear of questioning their religion. I understand that fear. I was there once. So I don't blame Muslims for resorting to all sorts of mental gymnastics in order to preserve the faith that gives them meaning, comfort, purpose and identity in a world full of adversity and pain. But as I have said before, if a wise and merciful God exists, then there can be no greater insult to him than the notion he would knowingly and needlessly create beings that will exist in a state of eternal and horrific suffering.